I really appreciate the opening remark from Mr. Li Junxi. Now, as the official beginning of the third China-Denmark Education Forum, for our first dialogue that is fabulous, as it is between the top education experts from Denmark and China. And here is my introduction of them. The first one is the member of the National Education Advisory Committee and the chairman, honorary chairman of the 21st Century Education Institute, Mr. Yang Dongping. Greetings to you all. And Professor Hans, it's so nice to meet you. Okay, welcome, Professor Yang. And our another expert is the chief expert of Danish education well-being and professor from Department of Education, Århus University of Denmark, Professor Hans Henrik Knoop. Professor Hans, could you say hello to our Chinese audiences? Professor Hans, could you say hello to our Chinese audiences?
Do you want me to present myself?
Could you please say hello to our Chinese audiences? Say hello to our Chinese audience.
Okay, hello, it's an honor to be here speaking to you about this very important topic of well-being among students. I look very much forward to this dialogue.
Welcome, Professor Han. As I'm really into psychology, so as a big fan of you, I feel really excited to see you today. So Professor Yang and Professor Knoop were both guests from our previous forums. So we are here all together in the third China-Denmark Education Forum. So the dialogue between you, the exchanges between you are highly expected by us. So now, let's get down to business. Professor Yang and Professor Knoop, as you're aware, the theme of this forum is education well-being. Education well-being, especially for Professor Knoop, as your major has always been well-being. So maybe our dialogue could be grand and macro. So how do you define well-being? As for many times, we will ask others about whether they are happy. That is a simple question, but that is really challenging to answer. So now I present this very challenging question to you. So which one of you will go first? Okay, I'll go first. Okay, Professor Yang. I think for the well-being of education, this very item in China is way ahead of time, and that was not touched upon to a large extent, as the highest evaluation of education was not about well-being or the satisfaction of our people on education. So that is the only definition of education in terms of its nature, and other evaluations are all evaluation by numbers. But we know that Nordic countries, and including some other countries, education well-being has become mainstream. That is a vital item in this societies, and also leading education. So for the growth of education and also the trend of education values, education of well-being is fundamental and significant. As education from the school-oriented education from the very beginning, merely for development of the nation or the military national development, to the education nowadays oriented at the well-being of the people. That is a major change. So China just started to realize that. But that is just some tiptoeing in this field. But Denmark excel in this field. Denmark is a forerunner in this range, so our dialogue is very vital. Yes, indeed. Denmark, in multiple respects, function really well, especially in terms of well-being. In terms of GNH, Denmark has ranked the first for multiple times. So Professor Knoop, Professor Hans, could you introduce us? Is it because of the trailblazing of the Denmark well-being education, and as a chief expert from your perspective, for a human being, how can he or she be defined as a person of well-being? Professor Hans?
Yes, thank you for the question. Well-being is defined in many ways in the literature, and it's also defined with great variety across cultures. So when I state a definition here, it's a broad one, but I still think it's universal to a degree. So a flourishing person typically experiences that life is meaningful. This means that the now, the sense of now is of value, and the perspective is optimistic. So if you don't have that, if you don't feel that your life here and now has any value, you will not be flourishing. You will not have well-being. And if you don't see an interesting future perspective, also you will not be likely to have any well-being. So that's a psychological component. And it's both cognitively and emotionally. So if you find the now of value, it should be something you can feel, but also something you can treasure by merely being aware of it cognitively. And when you look at the future as being full of perspective, you should feel the pull towards the future because it's interesting and it's gratifying to think of what you strive for. And at the same time, cognitively, you should have this sense of meaning. Why am I doing that? And be able to argue for that. So I think this is a core, this is a good way of looking at students and ask whether they have that kind of feeling, that kind of perspective, or whether they don't. And in Denmark, we are doing pretty good on this, but we also have these problems that we've already alluded to, which we see internationally also, that pupil well-being is difficult to maintain in some circumstances.
Okay, as Professor Knoop just mentioned, you haven't heard our Chinese interpreting? Yes, I haven't. So I was checking. I believe that you haven't selected the channel of interpreting. As you can see at the bottom, yes, I have chosen the Chinese channel. Yes, you need to select that.
Do I have to press something? I have a
汉斯先生是听到的是英文，对吧？现在
Okay, so Professor Hans, you just heard the English interpreting, right? You heard, right, Professor Hans?
有中文翻译吗？
As Professor Yan hasn't heard the Chinese interpreting. Yes, we have. All I can hear is Chinese. Yes. Okay. Okay, I see.
I don't know what is wrong.
Okay, maybe you need some help. Maybe Professor Yang needs some help. 1 minute, please. Okay, Professor Yang, for your laptop, Having just selected the Chinese channel of interpreting, yes, all I can see is the language button. You need to, okay, here is an icon, just like a globe. Okay, first click more, and then select channel. Yes, you should choose the Chinese channel. Yes, I have chosen that. Okay, so in your headphone, all you can hear is our Chinese interpreting.
Maybe I should try headphones.
And
But I think it works for Hans Henrik.
Yeah, it works. Hans Henrik have no problem. And sorry, Hans Henrik, just when Mr. Yang also didn't choose the right button. So when you talk, and he could not, I can hear, and Miss Gu can hear, but Mr. Yang didn't hear what you talked. So he just said, no, I need to know what Hans have talked. That's why I'm sorry for some technical problems.
不是那个不，安老师，我们从第一个问题重新开始。那个杨老师问
No, Mr. Yang, Miss Yang. So, Professor Yang already asked the first question. As we'll start on how we define well-being, and then we transit to the definition of education well-being. Okay, I'll skip the opening remark. Okay, I'll double check with Hans.
Wait, yeah, just wait a minute. Hans, can you hear me? And?
Yes.
Okay, so sorry, some technical problem in Mr. Yang's side. So we have to restart the first question. Hope it's okay with you. It's okay?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, thank you. 杨老师，您刚才我在说英文的时候，同传的中文声音到你那儿了吗
Okay, Professor Yang, while I was speaking,
Okay, 那现在都顺
did you
了。
hear
那现在
interpreting?
这个
Yes,
那
yes,
个我先
indeed.
专门
Okay,
给杜老师
everything's
第一个
smooth.
问题开始。
Now
好吗
we restart
Okay.
our dialogue from question number 1. Okay, Professor Yang, Professor Knoop will restart. Okay. Okay, here are the major challenges to you, our top professors. So our first question is, as our forum is aimed at the well-being of education, but I would like to start from a wider, a grander perspective on the definition of well-being, as all parents wish well-being for their children and wives wish well-being for their husbands, but well-being seems hard to define and track. So as you two are paying major concentration on well-being, especially for Mr. Knoop, for Professor Knoop, as you study well-being. So I would like to hear your definition on well-being. So which one of you will go first? Okay, I'll go first.
我觉得从个人的
Okay, from the perspective of my individual experience, well-being is very subjective. That is a concept
测量的可以简单的
that
测量
cannot
的
be measured simply.
就跟那个经济发展跟考试分
Just
数
like unlike the growth of economy or scores, well-being is to a large extent
但是呢
objective concept, subjective concept, but
幸福
still we could feel the differences among well-being, as some are happy and others are not.
对幸福的
So
感受啊
for the perception of happiness, of well-being,
也就是说
that is partly
啊你
from our value on how we see
那你得到
happiness. If we strive for
那相反的
success,
就不是这样啊，所以
then we may feel one way or we may feel it the other way. So that is a open item.
不同的环境中
But
啊，我们
in different circumstances,
给他那个不同的定义 我想可能是
We
这
may
样。
define that differently. So that is my understanding. Yes. So that is a perception really subjective, subject to one's value. So Professor Hans, could you share us your understanding on happiness?
On happiness and well-being? I would say that well-being is the experience of health and happiness and prosperity, and it includes having good mental health, high life satisfaction, and a sense of meaning and purpose, and the ability to manage stress. More generally, you could say that well-being is basically just feeling well, but I like that broader definition. And then then the sense of having a meaningful life where in the situation is a very nice way to approach this more complex definition of well-being. So we say that if a person, a student, senses that the life here and now has value and the perspective is optimistic, and this both is sensed as a feeling and cognitively, then there will be a sense of meaningfulness in the pupil's life, and they will also have well-being. So there are many definitions that come together here, but it's basically what it's about: good mental health, high life satisfaction, happiness, prosperity, and the experience of health and meaning. So I can go into detail with all of this, but it's basically about feeling well here and now and feeling well looking towards the future.
Okay. So that is up to one's feeling for the moment. Okay. As the hostess for this dialogue, for you, well-renowned professors, scholars, I can feel that I am gaining something here as your hostess. And I also see great significance at what I'm doing now. So by your standard, Professor Hans, I feel really happy now. So I would like to share my happiness with you also. Thank you so much for your answers.
Thank
Well,
you.
from my viewpoint,
但是我都是听到了，就是说，
well, you express that in different ways, but there are also something uncommon in your expression, which is the happiness for human beings is connected with cognition and value of them. Professor Yang just mentioned that is associated with the value, the directions of their value. So for our teachers, the education is vital in the development of values. So I would like to hear your opinion on for education for teenagers, for adolescents. Such education can impact the form of value for them. So that will also shape their well-being.
简单说一下，我觉得这个话题
Okay.
很大，因为
I'll touch upon that simply. That is also a macro item. As for juveniles, happiness of them is not only from family or school, that is also about the social culture. So that is really complex. But in terms of social culture, we can also perceive that
有一些值得一说的地方。
there are indeed something worth mentioning here. For China,
高度竞争化的教育
this ultra-competitive education
影响是非常大。
really
就是
reshape
教育就是
our students.
教育就是
Education is all about rankings and exams in China. Such a reality of education in China would highly spoil
这件事情的
the interest of learning and the well-being of learning for our students. So that is a major item, a major concern in China. The list is endless. School bullying and etc. is also part of that, but what's more important is about that. In China, education is exam-oriented, only for rankings.
伤害都是比较大的。
That would deliver great pressure and harm to our students. Okay, Professor Yang, the real enlightenment is on our first question, you mentioned that the value of well-being, of happiness, is associated with the general value of him or her. If someone strive for wealth merely, then his happiness, her happiness is associated with wealth. So what is more? There is no more. The greed would now come to an end. So that is in the same logic with our striving for scores. If I score at 99 scores, well, I could also score higher for 100. If I am the one that ranked the first in the class, then I may also have the grade of ranking the first in the entire school. So such striving for grades is a little bit similar to our endeavors for wealth after they grow up. Okay, such a concept is deemed as excessive
竞争的
competition, the overmuch
学习不能没有竞争。
concentration on competition. Actually, competition and ranking are inevitable in learning, but if there is too much of them, learning, studying itself will be spoiled. So that is just the truth. Okay, so for the excessive concentration on scores and the ultra anxiety in education, for that, I always deem that as an atmosphere for the East Asian cultural circle. But I've noticed that for education in Japan and South Korea, pure education have grown normal. I'm not sure about my perception about that, but the overmuch anxiety and competition in China in education, so is that really associated with our Chinese culture?
刚才说的这个
Okay, I think that
非常重要，就是
what you
大家
just
都
mentioned is really crucial. We all deem that,
全世界
especially for us Chinese, we always thought that education are all similar
现在已经越来越
all over the world.
国际调
For
查
example, in Japan and South Korea, education are all exam-oriented, but according to
国家要厉害，但是亚洲
ever-increasing
也是很
results of analysis,
尤其是今
that
年
is not the picture.
披萨测试啊，已经
Education differs in Japan, China, and South Korea. According to the PISA test, the result shows that in Japan and South Korea, the competition between students
在
is well below that in China. So among all of those countries, China is the one with the most competition in education. So for Japan and South Korea and other countries like them, they have fresh objectives in education. Well-being has already been deemed as a concept of education in Japan and South Korea, so that is worth mentioning here. Okay. So Professor Knoop, Professor Han, I have a question exactly in contrast to that. As we mentioned previously, we thought that for countries in the East Asian cultural circle, we find that these countries feature great competition in education. But for Denmark, as Professor Yang mentioned, Denmark really function well in well-being of education. But In our preparation for this forum, actually, the reason why this forum is themed at well-being in education and the right to be imperfect, that is exactly because we have noticed from some statistical data that in Denmark, the well-being of students is now lowering. Some of them may feel awareness of learning, and such students are growing. So we would like to hear your perspective. So is this phenomenon really exists in Denmark? So is it so? If it does exist, what is the source? What is the root cause?
I think that in order to address these topics of well-being, there are a number of distinctions to make. One is the distinction between an elite-oriented pedagogy and a pedagogy for everyone. And if you have a competitive system, it will often have the best students flourish to a degree, that they tend to score and have success in being the best pupils, but the big majority will have some kind of inferiority complex related to that, because they're just not good enough. And when we set up these competitive systems, not everybody can be on top. Only a few can be at the very top, and the rest will be below that. And if the standard is to be at the very top, we do put pressure on the large majority of pupils, and they end up feeling worse because of that. And I would like to say also that the way our emotional system works is that whenever you feel whenever you feel inferior, you will have negative emotions. So the well-being will suffer whenever we create a system where many people feel inferior. Now, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't struggle. And I would like to remind the listeners of this, the hierarchy of need that was produced by Abraham Maslow back in the day. And this hierarchy of need says that all human beings have a number of needs. They have physiological needs, they have safety needs, they have psychological needs, social needs, needs for achievement, needs for recognition, and also a need for originality, need for being a person who can contribute with something of original value. So these are needs that are rather universal. And whenever we have a need, there's a little unpleasantness connected to that, because a need, per definition, means that you are missing something or you lack something. So if we have the need to drink water, that's because we lack water. And if we are hungry, that's because we lack blood sugar and nutrition and so on. And when we have a need to learn, that's because we feel that there's something we should know, but we do not know. So we have this natural interest in learning. And the educational artistry here, the core educational challenge here is to make sure that the pupils feel the need for learning in school, but that these needs don't get too excessive, because whenever a need becomes too excessive, damage is done. So if you are thirsty and you cannot drink for a long time, your body will suffer. And if you are hungry and you cannot eat for a long time, your body will suffer. And if you lack safety, for a long time, our stress system cannot cope with that, and we will get damaged by too much cortisol in the system. So I think reading this very fine paper that Dr. Yang sent, and that he's also talking about now, about the problems of well-being in this very competitive Chinese culture and school system, could benefit greatly from understanding these mechanisms, these motivational mechanisms, in order to optimize student motivation for learning. Because there is an inborn motivation for learning, but there's also an inborn detraction from inferiority, or from something that feels dangerous, and from lack of control. And from what I understand, the Chinese system is influenced by these problems. So is the Danish, not to the same degree as the Chinese, I think, but we have these problems also because the way we structure our school systems, the way we monitor them, often do not support well-being. So like Dr. Yang said, when we are monitoring, when we are doing these PISA tests and so on, this may be politically necessary in order to see how we are doing. But once it hits the pupils and the schools in a way that they feel this naming and shaming situation, and they feel that their self-control is lessened because there's this outer surveying that you cannot do anything about, then well-being will decrease. And everybody suffers from that. There's something, the Danish politicians, we just had elections 2 days ago here, and the Danish politicians are very much aware of this problem now. They know that we have to govern in a way that doesn't take away the sheer joy of learning from young people, that doesn't take away their sense of agency and freedom and responsibility, social responsibility, and so on, by setting the whole control system outside of school. It has to be invigorating whenever we control a system. And the mechanisms that are necessary to understand, to do that, include what I was just talking about. But because these are psychological mechanisms, they typically have not been applied before the damage was done, because psychology was this profession that you only brought into play when there were problems, mental problems and so on. But what I was just talking about with the hierarchy of needs and the motivation and the adequate level of need that makes for satisfaction in school, that is just as much psychology as clinical psychology, treating the pupils when they already have their mental problems. So by applying this knowledge, which also positive psychology aims to do, it's possible to prepare and to apply knowledge to prevent the problems from even occurring or even happening, let alone grow to a high degree. And I think this is a key psychological contribution that can be made now, because we have such detailed understanding of human well-being. But politicians need to listen to that and understand that, of course, and the leadership needs to understand that and listen to that also. And the final point about that, when we monitor, when we measure and monitor, there's a lot of life quality in that also, in the sense that if you play a computer game, for instance, your life quality there, your fun playing the computer game directly depends on scoring, on seeing how well you're doing. So there's nothing wrong with monitoring how you're doing. the thing that is taking away the well-being that's depressing people is when they lose control over their own situation. Because as human beings, we come into the world self-organizing. So we have our brain tells us that when we have overview, when we feel that we are in control of our own situation, meaning that we have overview of things, we feel calm and safe and ready to learn. And when things are chaotic and we don't have control over things, we feel afraid and we narrow in and we enter this fight, flight, freeze mode where we have a very difficult time learning anything new because we're just focusing on this threat in front of us. And this should be avoided. We can avoid that in the future, and we can look at the different countries and see how they do that. And I think many countries are getting better and better at this. The understanding is coming into play now because we have this epidemic of depression among young people, not the least the girls, internationally. We can speak to that in a moment because this is also about the digital world. There are many. The digital life of young people plays a huge role in this also, in the Western world at least. So I hope that made sense.
我理解啊，汉斯教授的，就分享了很多内容，他其中
I really understand in the sharing of Professor Knoop, there is something vital. For a human being, after being born, we have the need for learning, which is very natural, just like the need of food or water. For example, for a toddler, he or she must need to learn to walk, as that is just a basic and natural need. So learning is originally a natural need, and that is also a joyful need. For example, for toddlers, after learning to walk, they are pleasant because of the self-satisfaction as they can control their body and explore the surrounding. But as education is aimed at bettering human beings, but there must be something wrong that our students getting to do not feel the need of learning anymore. And Professor Yang, I know that you do not like the sentence of don't lose at the beginning, as you think that we take away the joy of learning because we excessively deliver burden to our students. And just as Professor Knoop mentioned, there are too much control of our children with the overmuch ranking, so that there will be less joy in learning. Is that so, Professor Yang? So that is your opinion on not losing at the beginning, right? Yes, indeed. That is, this sentence was ubiquitous when the exam-oriented education was everywhere. That is originally a misunderstanding of the aim of education. In that sentence, education was thought to be a pure competition of rankings, of scores. This concept has done damages to many students, and that has also presented a misunderstanding to education to our students at the very beginning. education meant to be a natural process of getting to know the world and getting to know ourselves. But with rankings, with scores, with the so-called good grade, such joy was taken away. That was raised by Professor Gu Mingyuan, a well-renowned professor at Beijing Technology University. He said that a student scored 100 grade and cried badly at home. His father was curious. Why are you crying for such a high grade? Well, the student replied that there is another one also scoring high in my class, so that it was typical. When education, when learning is purely about competition, a negative competition, then the inner value, inner pleasure will disappear. So the well-being of education will also be gone. So about that, for our Chinese parents and students, we could not know that better. This is what they accept, but their problem is that they cannot get rid of that, as everybody is doing that. There are rankings and scores and grades everywhere in China. Whether we like it or not, it is just there. So such issues is not theoretical ones, but practical ones. So that has changed the orientations of schools. Yes, poor baby, for the 100 grade student, as he or she did not lose the joy of learning, but also the joy of friendship. For example, I was born in the 1970s. The competition while we were students was not that fierce, so we played a lot together back then. But I've heard that now, in some places, in some regions, students are told that your classmates are not your friends, but your competitors. But there are also some remarks like score one more score, and there will be 1,000 fewer competitors. So such a atmosphere has taken away friendships of our students. So that is very sad. Very too. Okay. For such a situation, I believe that Denmark, the Danish education is now like that. In China, competition in examinations is just so fierce. For parents, students, and teachers, that is the only evaluation benchmark here, which led to some distorted behaviors of all students. Among them, the typical ones are, for example, weariness of learning of our students, or some mental illness of them against learning. And for some of them, the viewpoint on education or life are also entirely shifted. They cannot perceive the joy of life anymore. So that is a major issue of education. Yes, indeed. So Professor Knoop, as Professor Yan also mentioned, that maybe in Denmark, the picture may be better. And we discussed that there is a well-renowned remark in China called "do not lose" at the beginning. This sentence has delivered great anxiety for teachers and parents, especially for parents. So they have put a lot of courses at a very young age of their students. So is there a similar viewpoint in Denmark? Maybe not. Okay, and here's another question. As a psychologist, if we want our children to enjoy their journey of life, so what kind of values should our children have at the beginning? What kinds of, is there anything more important than learning knowledge?
There's this is a fundamental question, or several fundamental questions again. And I would say a very easy way to understand the deepest values, I could say, is that, let's say that there are only two types of processes in the universe, it seems. There are growth processes and there are balancing processes. So when a child comes into the world, there's this automatic or self-organized direction towards growing, both physically and mentally, where you learn and create things. And there's also this necessity for regulation, for balancing your needs and your satisfaction, so that your needs don't become too excessive. So this can be compared with driving a car on your journey through life. And there are two things you need in order for this journey to be successful and joyful. You need to be able to use the steering wheel, that is the direction in your life. And the other thing is you need to be able to regulate the speed with your speeder and your brake. So if a pupil, if we have these two values, that the speed and the direction, the sense of being able to control your own speed and control your own direction to a degree is maintained when you enter the educational system, then many problems will be solved already by that. That means that when the teacher meets the pupil, all effort should be made not to put the pupil in a situation where the pupil is failing again and again, eventually becoming helpless. And also not to under-challenge the pupil so that the pupil is bored and not moving ahead and so on. Make sure that the speed can be set in a good way. And regarding the direction, of course, the direction is set by the government and the board and and adults, but it's hugely important for the pupil to understand the meaning, the why are we learning this. Once you understand why it is, and that it's a good idea to learn this, even though it's difficult and all that, then it's a much nicer ride through life than if you're just being told along or dragged along and you don't understand why this is a good idea, because you don't feel it's a good idea and you can't think of why it should be a good idea. So that is the very general answer to that question. More concretely, I would say also that biologically and brain-wise, neurologically, it's important to recognize that human beings are much better at thinking concretely, in concrete action, concrete sensory things, understanding pictures and sounds, things that you can sense. We are much better at that. Our brain is much better at that than it is at understanding abstract things. So as soon as we start becoming academic with the pupils, as soon as they meet the textbooks and the symbols and the equations and so on, things shift and become much more unnatural to us. And this is where well-being is often stifled. It's easier to have a good time in kindergarten than when you start entering the mathematics and so on, if you don't do it in the right way. But we can see that there are many examples of successfully entering also the academic disciplines without losing interest in it. So I would just mention that up front. And then to Dr. Yang's question regarding the kindergarten, the small children, the preschools, and the schools, there is more pressure. There has been a couple of decades in Denmark where there has been more pressure on preschools. And I think 97 or 98% of all Danish pupils actually go to preschool, because the women and men are working, so the parents don't have time for homeschooling in most cases. But there's also an awareness now that the joy of the kindergarten, the joy of preschool can get lost if the government doesn't function well enough, when the leadership doesn't work well enough. And right now we have a kind of a crisis. I don't know how big a crisis it will be, but there's a crisis in the working conditions for pedagogues in preschool. And this has been shown publicly, and the crisis is that much fewer students apply for pedagogy, for going to college and learning pedagogy, because they have heard that the working conditions are not good enough, meaning that the pupils also, the student or the children also suffer. So there's some tension around preschool here. But basically, I would say something along the lines of the Montessori approach is well advised. This is really what children need. They need to explore on their own terms. They need to be in nature as much as possible, I would say. They need to be in flow, to use that term, be in flow much of the time, learning through play when they are small. And indeed, this ideal remains an ideal throughout life. So when people consider why they have hobbies, it's very easy to see oftentimes that it's precisely because the state you're in when you're in the play, when you have this playfulness state when you're a child, is the same as you have when you are indulging your hobby. So the playfulness component remains very important throughout life. And I work with the Lego Foundation, and something called Lego Serious Play, the Lego bricks. They are actually very good in collaborating with many preschools and schools on this topic to get more playfulness into the pedagogy. When we look at the well-being of Danish pupils from school, starting elementary school and up to grade 3 or 4, the well-being level is quite high. On average, at least about 80% or 85% of children are thriving, and the rest, not that many, are really not thriving. Then it goes down a bit as we enter middle school and lower secondary school. Year by year, there are some problems that are occurring in Denmark also, especially 4 problems. One is boredom. Boredom is rising year after year, especially for boys, but also for girls. The influence, the sense of having a say, having a voice as a pupil remains a challenge here, which you wouldn't expect, but it is. And then we also have problems with disturbance. I think you may have less of that, but we have often a difficult time to create a serene place where you can concentrate and there's no irrelevant noise. That has been a problem for many years. And this is, of course, a bit of a protest from from the pupils also. So sometimes it's actually justified, but it doesn't do much good for the teaching, that you can't concentrate. And then finally, we've had some problems with hygiene in the toilets and the open spaces that are being dealt with. So, and then the recent years, especially the last 10 years, we have had these increasing problems with mental health that seems to be directly linked to digital media, especially social media, and especially for girls, creating an epidemic of depression that we have never seen before, and that's really alarming. And this again, this digital problem again is about social comparison, especially. So you post things on Facebook, and then you sit there anxiously waiting whether you will have enough likes to be likable. And we are not, by nature, we are not made for that. This is much too strong an influence to be exposed to when you are a small pupil. So this is really hurting them. And this adults have not really been good at setting these boundaries, because we haven't understood the mechanisms until now. But now I think we start to understand that. And again, one of the mechanisms is the Facebook control, the big tech control, where you have these cookies, and then you leave your digital personality by accepting cookies, and then eventually big tech knows more about you than you know yourself almost, and that means that they can optimize the effect that software use has on you. And this is being dealt with politically now also. The EU, the European Union, are tackling this head on now. They say if Twitter and Facebook and Google will not comply to European standards, they cannot operate. So there's a political responsibility there, while at the same time it's important to mention that it's a political responsibility where we do whatever we can not to do away with the right to speech, to free speech. It's very important to have free speech, but it's also important to have safety around our children and good guidelines for digital use. So this is affecting everyone. In the kindergarten already, we had the iPad. The kindergarten, they got one like this, an iPad, and then they can learn all kinds of things with their fingers and their cognition, but they don't train their social sensibility so well. They don't look at faces the way they should. They don't tumble around and use their muscles when they are too much on these iPads. So we are very aware that digital technology represents a whole dimension of challenges in education that relates to everything else we're talking about here.
Okay, from my perspective, that is beyond my expectation. I do not see that situation is a little bit serious in Denmark also. As Professor Knoop just mentioned, here are two dimensions that are significant to us. First of all, orientation, direction, and second, speed. If life is a journey, orientation, direction matters for what kind of person we would like to become and what kind of life we would like to lead. Direction is more important than speed. If we haven't thought thoroughly about what kind of direction we're heading towards, then the speed will also not be that significant. And another, the digital devices influence on our students is universal. For one thing, they are now closer to digital devices. So there will be another phenomena. Our children will be far from the great nature. Maybe when they do not want to learn, when we find that our students have the awareness of learning, well, that might be a little bit too late because besides their awareness of learning, they may find themselves unable to play, not the engagement with the great nature, not running or playing in the great nature. That is not their thing now. All they can do is playing, for example, video games and etc. So Professor Knoop's insights really enlightened me. It seems that the level of well-being of mine has lowered than the previous version at the beginning of our dialogue, as now I feel a little bit tense now. And maybe Professor Yang will find this clear that there are great anxiety in Chinese parents and for educators like you and for journalists like me. We might say that do not be so anxious to parents, but many parents would deny that to me. For example, many of them will say that to me. We should take a look at the college entrance examination percentage in China, as there are limited education resources in China. So I cannot just tell my student to be free from such competition. I must make sure that he starts soon and strive really hard. But in a lecture of Professor Yang, you mentioned that OECD has released its data in 2018, which really surprised you and surprised me also. Such data was from some developed German and Nordic country. I'm not sure whether Denmark was part of it. So it's like this for Finland, Germany, and Netherlands. Senior high students, even during their education in senior high, they are in vocational education. In Finland and Germany, the percentage was 70%, but in Australia and beyond, it was over 50%. But in general, it was over 70% of the countries that over one half of students choose vocational education in middle school. So the picture is not like that in China because all of the Chinese parents wish their children to go to universities. So I just do not understand why there is such a limitation of choices in China. Why do Chinese think that only entering universities will lead us a great life? Why are there so few options for us in China? Is it because of the environment, or do we choose that? Do we ourselves restrict ourselves? So how do you see that, Professor Yang? Okay, I think that we normally think that is a consequence of our mechanism from the government. But the subjective choices really matters here. But for the mainstream ideology in our society, we might find that such ideology hasn't served well here. All walks of life in our society are boasting how important a college degree is, regardless of the actual circumstance of students and families. Such a phenomenon was not so typical 20 years ago.
那个时候
Back when I was in Wamingishan University, that was not an issue at all. Back then, every family would make decisions based on their family wealth and the conditions of their children. Well, that is also concerned with the history's condition when there are over one child in one family. But with the family control policies, things start to change.
比较那个善良的、比较贤惠的
So
孩子
then,
让他在家里养
for
老。
the kind-hearted children, they might not go to universities. So there was a natural selection. But for now, we only have one child in China because of the family control policy. So we should just all treat the only one child as the genius in one family. So such a phenomena
但
has
是我
grown over the past 22 decades. But I believe that this phenomena,
独生子女的这个制度
after the lifting of the policy, and also
就业机会
with the growing
待遇 出现
employment opportunities and social status in other fields, this circumstance will be better because we know so well that not all students
大多数学生
are suitable for learning physics and beyond. Not all students are the top university materials. Well, for many of them, they could had a choice, but because of the expectations from parents and the outside world, they find that if they do not enter university, their entire life will be a great loss.
这几
So
我们看到
to
了
not be a loser, they have to engage themselves in such a competition. So during the past few years, we have noticed that,
在中国的城
for
市
example, in Shanghai,
骑摩托车送快递的
running
外卖的小哥啊，他的学历越来越
for the food deliverers,
有一个
actually
大概差不
their
多
degree are growing and growing. According to a survey, around 20% of the food deliverers are college graduates.
啊，像
And also for the
就是政府机构
for the
当中
grassroots public service
边缘的，包括
whose
甚至
responsibilities are not that great,
部门啊，
even for
越来越强，很多
some really periphery
优秀大学的学生
institutes and agencies.
啊，就是
So many college graduates are fighting just for one position there.
越来越脱离我
So
相信这种现象
the degree are getting
是一种
less and less associated with posts.
会使
So I believe that such a phenomenon
明白
would help better the circumstance,
做一件
helping the students understand that they should find their own way instead of
高学历
the way that the society is student.
非常重
They
要
should not merely strive for just high degrees.
需要改变
That is very important for Chinese parents and Chinese students. So
这种
we should especially change the mindsets of Chinese parents as they are short-sighted
完全
in this part.
是孩子的感受，孩子
They often
这
regard,
非常
they
非常
often take,
我听
they often make decisions regardless of the choices of their teachers. According to the well-renowned economist,
他写个
Professor Chen Zhiwu from Yale University,
美国的
in an essay,
一流大学
the
的
reason why
啊越来越不按照
business schools of top universities in the US will have fewer and fewer Chinese students recruited. Actually, as an example himself, there was a fabulous PhD under him
有很多的夸奖，但是
for over 3 years of PhD education.
他跟那个
That student was fabulous, but one day that student told his professor
不读了，
that I'm ready to go home.
妈妈搞了一个私人基金，想让他来
His
打理，
mom has a fund, so he should arrange that fund. So he just quit the university.
常惊
And
讶。
Professor Chen was really shocked. Professor asked him that, well, do you like the subject at all? And the student replied, that doesn't matter to me. Anything is fine by me. I can do any profession. I can be any professional. Well, this may be a typical case here that a vast majority of our children, in terms of vocation choosing, they do not have a say and they do not have their own idea. That is all up to their parents. And for their parents, even they're not even college graduates, knowing nothing about the subjects, they are the decision makers. So that is really strange, but phenomenal in China. So we appeal every child to be the master of their own lives. So on such decision making that is really vital, they must make their own decisions instead of merely listening to their parents.
并不是我们今天讨论的
So,
主题。但是
well,
说
although that is not a part of our topic today, it's just I would like to say today,
要建立自己的主见，
for
自己负责。
students to establish their own say, their own mindsets, to take care of their own responsibilities and choices, that is really significant. Yes, indeed. That is highly relevant to our topic, to our agenda. As you mentioned, in the well-being of education, with more options in education, there will be more well-being of education. As there's a saying that well-being, happiness is all about options. And the case you share, you said that is not a typical one, but as far as I'm concerned, such case is universal. I myself have met a PhD from a really prestigious university. After 3 or 4 years of college of PhD education, and told me that he was really struggling, that he would like to take the examination of public service to be some secretary of some leader, because all I want to do is just to stay behind the leader to write some random essays for the leader. So I also read the news about a PhD being public servers at grassroots positions, where I myself deem that as a great waste, not only a waste of national resources, as there will be major input of national resources in education for us to develop a PhD. And that is also a great waste for the professors and also for families, as there are also overwhelming input of our parents for those PhDs. So that is a waste of life in general, from the society to families, huge waste. But if the student could be to have the courage to make his or her own decision, well, such a waste may be avoided, as every profession, every field could have the top players. So we should choose the position, the professions that we really feel a passion. So if the students are forced to learn more, to be PhD and etc., there might be also phenomenal mental impact on them. So Professor Knoop, according to the data, the statistics of mental health in China and beyond, for example, the mental illness is not growing among them. And I'm really curious about the situation in Denmark and your perspective on that. So how can we help them mentally?
I didn't get the question. Can you repeat the question?
就是 在
Okay.
中国好像有关就是青
In
少年
China,
健康的一些调查数据。
according to the study surveys of mental health of teenagers, of adolescents, around 26% of our teenage students suffer from such mental illness. I'm not quite sure about the situation in Denmark. So for the mental health of adolescent students, what kind of recommendations you have, Professor Knoop?
Yeah, well, it's we have a similar situation in Denmark, not quite as bad, but if we compare 10 years ago with now, the mental health problems has doubled from about 10% to 20%. So it's really worrying, and on some parameters it's more than 30%. So it's there's really something to be done here, and something that's necessary. And I think relating to what Dr. Yang was talking about in China also, I think it's important to understand that even though we have these cultural differences, and which is wonderful that we have different cultures in the world, human beings are also the same species, and they, just like they need the right nutrition, certain vitamins, certain minerals in order to survive, we need these components of well-being. We need these life qualities in order to function also. So, for instance, safety, we cannot live without a certain level of safety, and we cannot live without a certain level of optimism, because nothing drives us if we don't have that. So that, and therefore when we talk about mental health also, we often, there are many scientists now and within psychology who begin to think that maybe we should not even differentiate between mental health and physical health, because as far as we know, our mind is a product of, it's part of our body, even though it's experienced differently. And so when you are physically well, you tend to be mentally well also, and vice versa. And this means that because human beings are the same biology across the globe, across cultures, there are also a number of needs that we simply have to satisfy, no matter what system we're in. And there, a certain challenge maybe in the Chinese system could be that because it's so ideologically, because China is so strongly ideologically founded, there may be some aspects of human nature that this ideology is trumping, leading to a certain degree of pressure on young people that we don't have in Denmark. I'm not sure, but it sounds like you really have some challenges there. And it's there in history, there are many examples also where you have rulers who have a certain idea about something and it turns out not to work. An ironic example was the Soviet Union, where when Stalin was there, he had this idea that if only you took the children away from their parents and made sure that you don't have any personal initiative, so he sent all the artists and the free laborers to the Gulag, then you would have a good society, and they would learn responsibility by being forced to do things against their will. Eventually, they would adopt responsibility. And what the Russians say now, at least ordinary Russians and the science, is that this did not produce responsibility, and it did not produce much well-being either. So the government was really not served well by doing that, by disregarding human nature and the need to bond with your parents, for instance. And so we in Denmark, we are very aware of making pedagogy that while it has an ideology to it, or it has all these pedagogical values, they still have to be as natural as possible. I would call it natural, so that we make sure that the pupils do not suffer physically, they do not suffer regarding safety. We try to avoid bullying, even though we're not that successful, but we have really campaigned against bullying. And we try to use the natural competitive joy in a more civil way. To give you one example, it's fun to compete. And, you know, rough and tumble play, everybody competes in a way that's fun, and gaming is fun. And so there's as long as it's not brutal or harsh or evil, competition can be very, very life inspiring and very, very learning rich, of course. And that means that we should avoid taking competition out of education in the fun sense, the hard, fun, playful, competitive sense. And a key to doing that without creating this evil competition is to, for instance, have a value that says pupils are to compete with themselves yesterday rather than with their peers today. This is a very nice way of putting it. You probably know all about it, but I'll mention it here anyway. So it's fun to compete as long as you're not afraid, as long as you just do your best and really make an effort to do your best. And one way to avoid this, to give social problems, is that the competition in school primarily is against yourself yesterday. So the fun thing is to try to improve what you do, be as good as you are. But the benchmark is you yesterday, not your peers today. And this works. If a teacher is able to create that kind of atmosphere, you'll have a lot of motivated pupils really trying to progress, just as you would want it if it was top down, all of it. But they are progressing in a self-controlled way, in a way where they feel safe enough because they are their own competitor. You just have to improve compared to yesterday. And this is fun. This is not just, you know, a hamster wheel where you have to, you know, run and run while staying in the same place. It's really fun because if you don't progress, you will be bored to a degree. You have to progress. So the motivation to progress is, we're trying to channel that so that you don't create this zero-sum gaming between pupils where one wins and the other loses, but rather a plus-sum game where everybody loses by doing his or her best. So this is a way to make sure that pupils are really trying to do their best, that they excel as well as they can without creating this social division or this social polarization. Also, when doing something like that, social responsibility is built up because pupils sense that this is a nice place to be. So therefore, this is natural also, they tend to reciprocate that. So if you feel that your surroundings are good to you, you will likely be good to them reciprocally. So when there's well-being in school, there's also much more social responsibility. And this would, I think, in a Chinese context, play directly into the social policy also. We want responsible citizens. Well, this is a way to do it. When people have freedom and not too controlled outside in what they do on the micro level, they tend to assume more responsibility for what is going on. So this is, you can get, as they say, you can get your cake and eat it too. You can have the best of both worlds. You can have freedom and responsibility. And this is something we have to learn. And I realize the important point that Dr. Yang is making about the structure that has been there for many years and that is very difficult to change. But things can change overnight when there's a realization that it's for the common good. There was an example in 1967 in Sweden, where Sweden overnight changed their traffic so that you have to drive in the right lane after having driven in the left lane for many years. And everybody was worried, this is a huge transition, many casualties, many will die in traffic, cars will be destroyed, it'll be chaos for a long time. There was not one accident when that happened because people were prepared for it. The government told what was going to happen. Everybody understood and said, now we have to learn to drive in the right side. So we speed down, we go slow until we're comfortable with that. No accidents at all. And if there's a national common interest in making sure that unnecessary mental illness does not occur, and we have some mechanisms, some tools, some insights that can be applied there. Like this little tool I mentioned before, competing against yourself yesterday rather than others today. So something like that can actually be applied very quickly if there's a general understanding that this is for the good of all. And if parents in China understand the sources for well-being, being meaning and engagement and social relations and curiosity and action and so on, physical health. When we understand that these are sources for mental well-being, there will be a broad common shared interest in applying that. And I think in Denmark, we have come to that point now. There is really nobody against doing more regarding well-being, because everybody knows children who are suffering now, and nobody wants to see their children suffer. Not if they have many children, not if they only have one child. So I think this is the optimistic side of applied science. Science applied in the right way is really of huge benefit. Yes.
好，谢谢韩斯教授的分享啊，
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Knoop, and thank you so much, Professor Yang. So today, we have elaborated on some major items on the modern education, but in the positive perspective, just as that is what Professor Knoop is working on. So these are the items that we have witnessed. So that is a first step. Recognition it and then change it. The shift of the entire society may take time. It may cost, that is about the comprehensive capabilities, but for each family, as parents ourselves, we can change ourselves first from ideology to actions. So, before the ending of today's dialogue, I would like to invite our two professors to say something for parents, those Chinese and Danish parents. So we want to hear one sentence recommendation for parents, but in terms of well-being of education. So one sentence. So Professor Knoop, could you go first?
An idea for parents.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
I would say that parents should view their child as you would view any other living being, be it a tree or a dog or any living being, and notice that they are growing voluntarily and they are trying to regulate their internal balance, their homeostasis, automatically, and that their child is curious by nature, that there are 6,000 mammal species on planet Earth today, and all their children play, all the young play, the puppies play, the kittens play, they all play, and human beings come into the world equipped to play, because they learn intensively when they play, and they enjoy intensively learning through play, and they will, if they are so lucky as to be able to have a hobby throughout life, be in this playful state by preference all through their life. What we know today is that the way to be concentrated and focused and making an effort to be in this playful state is very similar to what is needed in order to feel good in school. If you read a book, you want to be concentrated, you want to not to be disturbed and distracted. And even though it may be difficult to start the book, if it's a novel, if it's a successful reading experience, the book will soon start to read itself, as we all know. And this is a fantastic thing, because this shows you that an effort concentrating on something that's interesting quickly can, even though it demands effort to focus on something interesting, it very often turns effortless. It very often shifts so that it becomes an effortless experience, and you are in flow with what you do. This should never be taken away from children. This is not difficult. They are born equipped to be in that situation, and we should make sure that the learning environments,
Okay, Professor Knoop, sorry. Okay, thank you so much, Professor Knoop. So your suggestion is to respect our children, to deem them as independent beings. Okay, now, Professor Yang, what is your one sentence recommendation to parents?
我觉得，对孩子的教育，
Okay, from my perspective on education, despite the importance of academic performance and ranking, which we should seek for, it what really matters is the kind-heartedness, sympathy, and also the independent personality, independent habits. of our children. We have found that for many children, after entering puberty, they just have no habits, and they do not have their own personalities or perspectives. That is such a waste of a beautiful time. But many parents just don't see that. All they care is to turning their children into maybe just a part of the society. We need to remember that we need to translate ourselves into the best version of ourselves, to have our souls with kind-heartedness. That is what we should be. Okay, thank you so much, Professor Yang. Indeed.
So I think that although you express that differently, but the destination is shared, we need to think from the bottom line of the physical and mental health of our children, and also what this forum is about. Thank you so much, Professor Knoop and Professor Yang. So that is for our dialogue today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. 哇，辛苦了，大家刚才可能汉斯教授最后一句杨老师说的时候，我们同传伙伴可能在选频道的时候，没有注意，可能
And for the last sentence of Professor Hans, it might be some technical issues of channel selection of interpreting. Thank you so much.